So, Assalamu alaikum, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Munaza Aslam. I am based in the UK. Thank you so much to Dr. Mevish and colleagues for inviting me for this very interesting webinar. I just thought I'd give a very brief overview of I think Mevish has mentioned what I have done in the last 18 years or so, but I think it's important to mention how this trajectory has led me to conduct a lot of systematic reviews, rigorous reviews, and what I will be talking about. I'll share my slide deck and then I will start. I hope you can see my screen. I hope that is visible.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So, basically, I started as an economist, but over the last 15 years or so, I have worked a lot on policy areas. And I worked a lot with the UK government. I'm based here in the UK, but I do a lot of work and quite a bit of work in contexts such as Pakistan, but also global contexts. And I think this is an important reason why, things that, the tools that have been used over the past many years have evolved. And I wanted to talk about how we can conduct and publishing. I will mention very briefly towards the end, systematic reviews, and I will be providing a very education researcher's perspective because that is what I am. I know that systematic reviews are extensively used in the health sector. In fact, they have evolved from the health sector, and they are the gold standard of researchers' tools. Having said that, they have found a place in education research as well. Currently, I am the research director of the largest education research program in Pakistan. It is the DARE RC program, and I also am the managing partner of a think tank that works in education in Pakistan, but also globally based here in the UK. So I can't seem to move my slides. Okay.
You muted again.
Okay. So I have not pressed mute, which is very strange, and I can't seem to move my slides forward. So let's try this again. Okay.
Yeah, we can see your slides now.
So the problem is, Mevish, sorry, just give me 2 seconds. You can see my slide now, right? Perfect. Okay, this is some kind of a tech issue. So before we talk about systematic reviews, one of the first things that, it's worth reminding ourselves of is why would you actually go ahead and conduct any literature review? Because a systematic review is a type of literature review. You would want to conduct a literature review to understand the current state of knowledge in the area. You want to understand what methods people are using. You want to understand the conceptual frameworks that people have used. You want to understand what evidence exists in the field that you're trying to explore. That's one of the objectives of conducting a literature review. Another objective is obviously to refine your research and your research questions. But also that it also allows you, obviously you also want to identify the research gaps. By conducting a literature review, you will be able to identify what people have managed to do, what people have not managed to investigate through their research. And that is obviously a critical objective of conducting a literature review. A literature review will also allow you to establish a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework or even a theory of change, depending on the type of work that you're trying to do. And it will also help you hone in on the theoretical framework of the research that you're trying to conduct. By doing a literature review, you will also be able to demonstrate rigor and quality. I can't think of a single research paper, regardless of the field we are working in, whether it's health or education, any academic field will require you to conduct a literature review to demonstrate rigor and quality. In fact, as a PhD student, or even as a master's student or as an MPhil student, one of the first tasks that you are given when you're conducting research, doing a dissertation or a thesis, is to conduct a literature review. And that is ultimately for the purpose of demonstrating rigor and quality. And then finally, a literature review will allow you to inform your own methodology, the methodology of your own research. Also help you understand what others have used so that you can basically, again, hone in on the methodology that you use. In terms of the common types of systematic reviews, types of literature reviews that exist, I have taken this because I wasn't sure the audience and the nature of the audience. I thought, let's start to talk a little bit about reviews, but also think of it from a different framework, from a different viewpoint. Literature reviews will basically, the most basic form of a literature review is just that. It's a literature review. It summarizes a topic that is broad in scope. In health, for example, you could be looking at cancer treatment, for example, and that is a very broad review that you could be doing. Typically, literature reviews that are most basic will adopt a qualitative approach. They will be quite narrative in nature. They may use sources that are potentially biased. So, for example, there's no restriction on a literature review having a specific type of study that forms part of that review. It's also important to remember that in a very simple literature review, you will be guided by some kind of a question, but that question will not necessarily be very specific. And there is no restriction on the quality of the research that you bring in, nor is there a restriction actually on making sure that you're sweeping the entirety of the evidence base. So you don't necessarily need to define what type of studies will be included. You could look at everything, you could miss different things, but nobody would really question you because that's what a literature review is. Even though it may be considered very high quality, it is still very different from a systematic review. Now, a systematic review is just that. It's highly systematic in nature. One of the biggest factors that distinguishes a systematic review from a normal standard literature review is that it answers a very specific question. In health, for example, it will answer a clinical question. So for example, vitamin C, or is vitamin C or chemotherapy a better cancer treatment in patients over the age of 40? You'll notice that unlike in a literature review where you're just looking at, cancer treatment, in a systematic review, your question will need to be very, very specific. And I will talk as I proceed with this presentation on very, very specific characteristics of a systematic review. You will define a very specific search strategy. You will list what will be included and excluded in the article selected. It could include a meta-analysis. So it could include an analysis of existing systematic reviews and extraction of data from those within the review, but that's not necessary. And then finally, another type of analysis that exists, another type of review that exists is a meta-analysis that looks specifically at studies from systematic reviews. So for example, in health, you'll have a lot of systematic reviews that have been conducted on, for example, specifics of chemotherapy in cancer treatment. As a means of cancer treatment, for example. So you will look at all of the systematic reviews, and then you combine all the similar studies and extract the data from those to get a statistically significant result. Now, this is quite a quantitative approach, unlike a narrative kind of synthesis approach. And this is, if you want to say, the king or the gold standard even amongst reviews, even above a systematic review, because it provides very, very clear statistical analyses which may overturn the results of very small trials. So what you're doing is you're collating the evidence that exists in what you are calling a gold standard systematic review in a meta-analysis. Having said that, having worked in the education field for many, many years, I think systematic review is one of the most misused terms in education research. And I don't say this lightly. So as part of my role as the research director of the DARE RC program in Pakistan, and even before that, I've been involved as a team lead, for example, in the Girls Education Challenge, another FCDO funded program based here in the UK for the last 6 years. And we have, in that process, we have reviewed a lot of proposals that have arrived through different, organizations. And in that, one of the things that I've noticed extensively is that people mention that they will be conducting a systematic review and it's used very loosely. Everyone will want to conduct a systematic review. What they actually mean is that they're going to be conducting a literature review that is going to be systematic. It's not a systematic review. And I think when as students and as colleagues who are working in this area, I think we need to be very careful in how we use this term, because a systematic review is just that. It is a systematic review which follows very, very stringent conditions. Not every review is a systematic review, and using that term loosely will land you in trouble, because if somebody is looking to see a systematic review and you're not conducting one and following the standard procedures, then it is not a systematic review. So just to recap, there are different types of reviews. Now, I've mentioned simple literature reviews, I've mentioned systematic reviews, and I've even mentioned meta-analyses. What I have not so far mentioned is what is called a rigorous review. Now, this is a term, I think, that is not used a lot in many fields, but if you look for the word rigorous review, and if you try and put, for example, my name down, you'll see that I have actually conducted a lot of rigorous reviews. Now, this term was coined almost about 10, 15, 10, 12 years ago here in the UK. And I think, for education research, I'm saying. And what it does is that it sits somewhere between a simple literature review and a systematic review. And the reason why this review exists is because of the realization that a simple literature review is too simple and a systematic review is too stringent in education research, at least. So we needed something in between these two types of reviews, so that they added rigor to the review process, but were not as restrictive as a systematic review is. And you'll find out how strict a systematic review is as I proceed. Now, it's important to recognize that whichever type of review you use, you have to basically look at the question that you're trying to answer. You have to look at the field of interest. So systematic reviews are very common in health literature. And there's a reason why they're so common in health literature, because there are a lot of randomized controlled trials and experimental studies that are conducted in the health field. This is not the case in education research, where a lot of the research is not necessarily able to identify causal linkages, and we're not able to conduct as many randomized controlled trials. And so I'll give you an example of an instance where, systematic review was conducted in very early days, about 14 years ago by the UK government. They commissioned someone to conduct a systematic review. And this was when systematic reviews in the UK were just starting out. They were not very new in the education field. They've been conducted extensively in the health field. And somebody thought, oh, it would be a great idea to conduct a systematic review in education. And it requires a lot of protocols. It requires a lot of stringent conditions. And what happened was that they asked a very specific question, which is a key feature of systematic review. The researchers followed the instructions of the process. And in the end, what they ended up doing was they ended up with just one study that met the conditions. And that one study basically was the only study that they could talk about. So they followed a whole process and ended up discussing just one study. Now, that makes you think that maybe systematic reviews may not necessarily be the best solution to the question that you're trying to answer. So it's important to look at the objectives of each of these reviews, think about your own research question, identify the pros and cons of each, and only if your research question can be answered properly using a systematic review should you actually attempt one. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about how actually do you conduct a systematic review. And in doing so, it's so if you think about the systematic review in very simple terms, this is slightly what it looks like. So you have a review life cycle. You start at the very top from searching. Even before that, I will come to the research questions. You obviously have a very clear research question. This is followed by searching for the relevant literature. This is followed by screening that literature to make sure that it is relevant for inclusion or needs to be excluded. Then you extract the full texts of the identified studies, and you then extract data from those studies and you appraise them. So you conduct a quality appraisal and then you report the findings. Across all of this is, of course, project management, if you know whoever's conducting the systematic review, and it's kind of like a circular process. I wanted to use an example of a systematic review I conducted in early days with some colleagues, and I've provided a snapshot of what it was. This particular systematic review was one of the first ones actually conducted in education research, at least by myself and a few colleagues. In 2016, it got published. So we looked at the evidence and we were looking at the questions, I would say, from the end of 2014 and in 2015. This particular systematic review is obviously very education specific. It aimed to look at reforms to increase teacher effectiveness in developing countries. And the next few slides are just an example of how we conducted the systematic review to give you some guidance on how it can be applied. Obviously, the overarching question was what I've just said. It was bigger, but then that specific question was broken down into sub-research questions. And I've just listed those questions here. And I've listed them here. I'll read them very quickly, but I want you to focus on the red bold bits. So for example, the first research question was, what is the evidence on the impact of reforms/interventions of education systems at scale to increase teacher effectiveness on the quality of teaching and on learning outcomes in low and middle income countries? Then question 2, what is the evidence on the relationship between educational reforms and interventions for improving teacher effectiveness at scale and the quality of teaching and learning outcomes in low and middle income countries? And then research question 3, where reforms or interventions to education systems to increase teacher effectiveness at scale have occurred, what is the evidence on how technical, financial, and political barriers have been overcome? Now, many people in this session will either have some kind of an economics background, education background, or political economy background, and will pick up on some of these things. The very first thing is, this was not the original question that we were posed, because that question was then broken down and we actually ended up with these subset of questions after we had conducted what is known as the protocol stage. So every systematic review goes through a design process where you identify the questions, you basically set out what is known as a protocol. Most systematic reviews can be conducted and should be conducted using very specific software. You can use the Epi Reviewer software, which I have used extensively. You can use the Campbell software. You can use different types of softwares. What those softwares allow you to do is that they allow you to basically follow the very specific requirements that systematic reviews require. So for example, in the first instance, here we have the research questions. These research questions are education-specific research questions, and you can instantly see how. And these research questions, by the way, were honed in after we had developed the protocol, because that was where the design phase happened. And with the client, which in this case was the UK government, we basically discussed with them that whilst the first question is going to allow us to identify the impacts of reforms or interventions, to be able to do so, we need to identify very specific types of studies. So the impact of something can only be assessed when you look at very specific type of research. So only studies that are experimental, such as randomized controlled trials, or studies that are quasi-experimental in nature, only those will allow you to identify impacts. So in that, knowing that, we introduce the second question, which looks at the relationship. Now, the relationship question can be answered by studies that use other types of methodologies. So for example, more descriptive studies or more correlational studies, and not necessarily experimental studies. And this is an important thing in education research, because where do you fit in qualitative research in all of this? You will have evidence in qualitative research. So these relationship type answers can be reached through identifying qualitative studies. And then finally, the question number 3 basically is not even about impacts or relationships. It's about extracting evidence on the more of the political economy factors, and studies will have this. So you should, in education research, be able to identify those channels through which change happens. Before I proceed, I also want to mention that one of the first things that you need to do when you're looking at defining your questions and sub-questions is also instantly pick up on what it is that your ultimate strategy will need to focus on. So you obviously need to look at the impacts and the relationships. You also need to look at the political economy factors. One thing that I can instantly see in these questions is that the client wanted to ask us about scale. How do you define scale? What do you mean by interventions of teacher effectiveness? What does teacher effectiveness mean? And then finally, how do you identify studies that focus on the quality of teaching and learning outcomes? And I can also see that low and middle income countries form our important group. So we'll need to exclude all the countries that are not low and middle income countries. So all transition economies and high income countries will not form part of our systematic review. So even at this question stage, you will instantly start seeing what your inclusion and exclusion criteria will be. So just to remind you that, it is at the research question stage that you will start thinking about the type of evidence that you can draw upon. So for example, going back and reminding you that impacts can only be studied using experimental and quasi-experimental research. Relationships can be studied using descriptive and qualitative research, and the broader barriers, challenges, enablers will be extracting more of the political economy aspects, which can even be found in qualitative research, for example. So the next step, once you've identified your research questions, looked at them, discussed them, developed your protocol, is to develop the theoretical or conceptual framework. It might even be called the theory of change, depending on the type of work that you're doing. In this instance, this is a very simple theory of change that we developed. If you see, it's nothing complicated. All it did was, based on the research questions, it looked at the interventions. So for example, we looked at the various types of teaching and teacher interventions that will ultimately have an effect on student learning outcomes. And you can see some of them listed here. So for example, teacher training schemes or teacher merit pay schemes, their recruitment and deployment schemes. Then we identified the pathways through which these interventions will have an effect on teacher quality and teaching quality and also learning outcomes. So for example, these schemes might reduce class sizes, or they might empower local communities, or they might, for example, reduce multi-grade teaching. And within all of this, we are saying that you have drivers of change or barriers to change, and these are the political economy aspects. So this is a very, very simplistic theory of change or a conceptual or theoretical, framework that was created against which the evidence from the systematic review can be mapped. Okay. Now moving on to the actual meaty part of a systematic review. So now you've honed in on your research questions. You now need to identify and describe the studies, and you need to follow very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. For that, I suggest you use the PICOS framework and you can read more about it on Higgins 2011, which basically sets out the following features. It says, okay, you need to identify what your population is. In this example, for example, we are saying it's going to be, low and middle income countries. We will obviously need to exclude high income countries and transition economies. What are the settings going to be in this context? For example, we are going to only focus on children studying in primary and secondary schools. We'll exclude children studying in higher education institutions or individuals studying in higher education institutions. Then you will define what your interventions are. Your interventions already, I've mentioned some of them. You just make sure that you pick out all of those, whether you're going to have a comparison group or not. So for example, to answer question 1, you will need a comparison group because you're looking at very specific randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental studies. But for the qualitative studies, you don't need that. And that forms part of the systematic review in this case. Which outcomes will you focus on? Specifically studies that have explored learning outcomes, but do you also want to allow for studies that have looked specifically at teaching quality, or no? In this instance, no, because the question was very clearly saying that the teacher effectiveness interventions will have had some effect on learning outcomes. So you're very clear in your understanding of what this is going to be. You might also want to consider inclusion or exclusion based, for example, on the date. you don't want to necessarily go all the way back to the 1930s, for example, to look at specific studies. So you'll set a date boundary. In this instance, for example, I think we went all about 15 years back and closed off the studies to 2014 because that's when we were conducting this review, 2015. Language is an important factor because many low and middle income countries in our case, for example, were in Latin America. And we didn't want any studies that were in Spanish or, other languages or, for example, French in certain parts of Africa. So we excluded those. And you need to be very clear mentioning this in your systematic review. Other factors, in our case, scale. So the question was very clear, at scale. What do you mean by scale? Does it mean that a certain population size has been reached, for example? And at what point do you apply this restriction of scale? Is it at the very beginning that you put scale? But many studies, by the way, don't necessarily mention the word scale. Okay, so what we did in this particular case is that we allowed for a filtering process that resulted in a number of studies, and this restriction of scale was only applied towards the end so that we didn't miss any studies. So you need to consider all of these factors. Now, once this has been done, one of the most intensive stages, and which requires a bit of time, is searching for relevant studies. And that requires developing a search a strategy which will require extensive coordination. So if you have a team of people working, you need to consult each other, come up with search terms. It's an iterative process, and you need to agree search terms to cover all possible synonyms. Because, I mean, don't forget that this is an approach where you're using technology, where you need to think of different approaches. Now, AI can be very useful. I haven't used personally AI, but I would imagine that AI can be really useful at this stage to allow you to search for the relevant studies and come up with the right terms and right synonyms to cover all possibilities. You also want to identify search terms to cover different types of literature, for example, qualitative and quantitative. So you want to have RCTs, you want to have randomized, so I mentioned randomized controlled trials. You might want to have, for example, participatory approaches. If you're thinking of qualitative research, you want to have, different kinds of things, correlational studies, descriptive studies, logic models, probit models. So all of these need to be part of your search strategy. Your search terms should definitely link directly with the research questions. And I can't emphasize this enough about how important it is not to wander and go into a completely different direction. Keep going back to your research question and link your search terms. Think about each part of the research question and what search terms need to be. They also need to link with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. I've already mentioned the inclusion and exclusion criteria in the previous slide. You need to say, okay, middle income country, what does it mean? You might need to have search terms to mention all you will need to have search terms actually, which include all low income countries based on certain lists, all middle income countries, for example, government schools as they are called in different parts of the world, if you're doing a systematic review, for example. So all of these things are very, very time intensive. And I'm quite sure that AI is a very useful tool at this particular stage to help you out. Then in your field of interest, you need to make sure that you make a list of all the databases that need to be identified and searched. So for example, just two very simple examples given here, ERIC and EconLit, you need to search, for example, and they will be available in different databases, but you need to sit and do the search yourself to figure out which databases you will need to be searching across. Based on that, all of that work, you will come up with concepts. I think in our case, we had 5 concepts, and all of these concepts were focused on different things. For example, here I've just shown different searches in the ERIC, EBSCO host, for example, database using and within that ERIC, using 2 of the concepts. So for example, concept 1 was focused on, it's all there, academic, child, classroom, education, learning. You can see the synonyms that we used. Concept 5, you can see, is the list of countries that will be part of the lower middle income. I think in this case, it's low. So you can see that you will have a certain search strategy. And you can see that here we've said that concept 1 and concept 5 searches were run using the strings below with data limitation. We went from 1990 to 2014 and limiting the results to primary and secondary education. etc. And it resulted in over 1,000 hits. Okay, now once you have done that, you have done your searching, you have identified however many studies. Now I'll take you very quickly to what we ended up with, our map of studies. But before I do that, I wanted to mention the next stage, which is screening. Now, if you go back in your minds to that graph, which I showed as a circle in the very beginning, screening comes after the search process. Now, I think it's important, and this is something nobody actually tells you, but having done a lot of systematic and rigorous reviews, screening happens at two stages. Okay, in my mind, it happens in the stage where your first subset of studies has been identified. So, for example, you've done all your searches, and suppose you ended up with 1,000 studies. Then you will screen on title and abstract. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the AI or whatever method you're using to come up with it, whichever tool, Epi Reviewer, whatever you're using to come up with your study lists, it's at the end of the day not a human mind. So you will end up with some studies that are not necessarily relevant. Sometimes it's a simple task of just being able to read the title of the study, and instantly you'll see that it's not relevant. Either not relevant because it's not relevant to the question you're trying to answer. It's not relevant because it might be that it somehow ended up with a study in, for example, many studies we ended up with were in North America. Somehow it didn't catch the fact that America, for example, could be North America, could be Canada, could be a high-income country. So some of these things will happen at the end of the day, and this is where the human mind is very important. Sometimes you'll actually need to look at the abstract itself of the study, and even the title will seem fine. But once you start reading the abstract, you will instantly see that, in some aspects, it is completely not relevant. So I can give you an example. It is even at this stage that you'll find that it is pertaining, for example, to a very small sample and has nothing to do with scale. And that's where your judgment will apply on what it is that your research question is trying to answer. Then the next stage where screening is important is where you need to do the full text screening. So once your title and abstract screening is done and you go through the filtering process, you will retrieve full text. This will become a bit clearer when I show the flow chart, but when you have retrieved the full text, you will then look at screening again to make sure that the text that you have got, the document that you have, the entire paper is actually relevant to what you're trying to answer. Once you have the final list of papers, of articles, you will extract the data from those. I would suggest that you extract data, and this is why it's important to have a software to help you, because you should be actually, in fact, you should be coding at all stages, and some form of data extraction should be happening. So the Epi Reviewer software will actually help you from the very beginning. What you need to do is code on, so for example, country, type of research question, different things, type of intervention, study design, outcomes. And it is important to extract some form of data even from the beginning, even for the studies that you're ultimately not going to use, because then you can create something like this. I don't know how visible this is. I do apologize. It's a snapshot from the 2016 paper that I just shared earlier. But what it does, it shows you the process that you need to follow as an example to conduct this review. Now, this is from searching to mapping to synthesis. So we have, obviously, the process includes developing the research questions, but this particular tool will allow you to do, and I feel like I'm running out of time, so I need to zoom through this, but I think this is an important, maybe I will spend like a couple of minutes on this simply because I think it helps to understand the process of systematic review. So in this instance, in our example, we had almost 4,000 citations, which our search yielded. Now, this is why, if you'll see here, the citations were excluded based on this. This is why coding and data extraction, as I've said, is important to some level. What it does is that it says from the 4,010 citations, once we did the title and abstract screening, we were able to actually exclude over 3,600 of those on the basis of, for example, that their intervention was not relevant, or, the language was not relevant, etc. And just on that screening, we ended up with 381 citations. Then we had some duplicates, removed those, ended up acquiring 325 reports. 321 reports, because 4 reports we couldn't obtain for whatever reason. Then we obtained 321 reports. And I think this, you need to mention it within systematic review, why you have not obtained them. And then a full document screening happened again on the 321 reports. And the basis of that, you can see why we excluded what we excluded. This is all coding and data extraction, by the way, which is important for us to be able to come up with, ultimately, to say that there were 36 studies that we included. But then we excluded some more based on quality assurance. And I'm going to come to that in the next stage. In the end, our review was based on 15 studies. So this systematic review that I'm sharing with you as an example was based on 15 studies. Now, coming to the quality appraisal stage, I always feel that quality appraisal is never a one-step process. Quality appraisal needs to happen at all stages of your systematic review. However, I think the 2 most important stages for quality appraisal are where, once you've kind of extracted the 36 studies that we talked about, then you need to basically look at develop some kind of a hierarchy to judge. And I would highly recommend for those interested in education research to look at the BE squared tool. The link is here, that looks at assessing the strength of evidence in the education sector. Now, this tool, I developed this with colleagues a long time after, we were doing the systematic review in 2015. But this is a very useful tool because before that, we were just using some form of a judgment on, okay, what methods are these studies using? Are they published in high quality journals, etc.? But what this allows you to do is assess the strength of individual studies and the strength of evidence across the board. Based on that, you will end up removing some of the studies from your systematic review. The next stage at which quality appraisal is also important is once, for example, you have the final list of studies that you have got, for example, 15, you then want to look at the overall body of evidence and assess that as well. So there are 2 specific stages where you need to do that. I want to give an opportunity for people to ask questions. I will talk through the remaining few slides fairly quickly. So the analysis and reporting stage depends. In health literature, it's different. In education research, it's different. In our case, I can tell you that because of the type of studies we had, they were not just randomized controlled trials. We had qualitative studies, we had some gray literature, which we, even in our systematic review, we couldn't have gray literature. I can't say that. We had journal studies, journal publications. The gray literature can go into rigorous reviews, but not into systematic reviews. But we did have qualitative studies. And so how do you actually analyze and report it? Because if you have different types of studies, you can't conduct any statistical analyses on that. So we adopted a more of a narrative synthesis approach, where you basically extract the evidence and just talk about, oh, this study has found this, and this study has found this, and this body of evidence on this type of intervention tells us this, for example. And that's still a very useful approach to understanding the what evidence, high quality evidence can tell you. As I mentioned, meta-analyses are more common when you have various systematic reviews and you can extract information from those. In education research, it is very restricted. I don't think, maybe there are a few, but in the context I work in, I haven't seen many. I mean, I'm sure there are other approaches in health literature. I am not aware of that. So in health, there must be other approaches that are used. And finally, just how would you convert a systematic review report into a journal publication? It would be following the same process as any publication needs to follow. You need to make sure that, you look at all the journals which will publish your systematic review. For that, in health, there's a whole journal actually called Systematic Review that publishes them. I am not aware of any such journal in education research. You would need to follow the same standard procedures. You would need to have an introduction, a simple literature review, the purpose. And this is why, if you want to actually publish in a good quality international journal, I would highly recommend that you use the right software to actually conduct a systematic review, to make sure that you are actually conducting a systematic review rather than a review that you're calling systematic. I will leave it at this and just open up, I suppose, to questions
Thank you
now.
so much. This was really insightful. Even I learned a lot from your session. Thank you so much. So we have opened up the chat. We're going to keep taking the questions, but for now, I'm going to start with different frameworks. Like we have in the chat, different people are asking that there are different systematic literature review frameworks available, including Prospero, Prisma, because how should researchers select the most appropriate?
Thank you, Mevish. I think it all depends on the question. So I think you need to be this is my view, and I could be wrong. There are people who might adopt a different perspective on this. The reason why I suggested the PCOS framework is because it is the one that has been the most relevant to the research that, kinds of questions that we've been answering in education research. The 2, 3, 4 systematic reviews that I've conducted. But of course, the type, and I would urge actually, I think researchers to look very carefully at what those frameworks offer and then map them against the questions. So I think that's an open thing for people to look at, because all of these frameworks have their own pros and cons. They can be very restrictive, they can be very open. So I would suggest that people look at the question. I think ultimately the biggest mistake we all make as researchers is that we don't necessarily look at what the question is asking. And I'm guilty of making that same mistake myself many a times. So I think that is it. The other thing I did want to mention, and I have not actually mentioned, is that actually a systematic review can't be done in 2 months. It can't be done in 3 months. A proper systematic review, typically from start to finish, takes about 8 to 9 months. So it's quite it's about as long as, for a baby to be born. It's like that intensive. It requires huge thinking behind it. So anyway, I think that very much depends. Mevish, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Shuffling between too many windows. So now that we're talking about different frameworks, there is also a new trend of registering your systematic literature review online to add to the credibility. Now, most of these sites, for example, Prospero also, it does not cater to social sciences. So can you please explain that? Does PCOS offer this kind of feature that you can register your literature review for others to see?
So I don't know whether it's going to be PCOS, but I do know that if you are, it is important to register. And I think that's what I was alluding to when I was talking about the Epi Reviewer website. Because what Epi Reviewer does is it allows you to register your systematic review. And it is important if you're following the whole process. Now, obviously, there are pros and cons of that, because Epi Reviewer is quite an expensive tool. It's quite an expensive website, but they do register, and actually then the protocol will be published. I mentioned the protocol very briefly, but people who have worked in systematic reviews will know that the protocol is a very important stage of a systematic review, and it gets published before the systematic review comes. So I am not aware of the Prospero or other sites. I apologize, I'm quite ignorant about that, but I do know that the Epi Reviewer will publish and your protocol and your ultimate, register your review as well.
All right, thank you. So we have some questions where people are asking that, is it a good idea to combine different strategies for conducting literature reviews?
I'm not sure what that question is asking. You mean to say combine systematic reviews with something else?
Yeah, with something else.
So I would suggest that, I think the issue I have with systematic reviews in education research, at least, is that they are very restrictive. They're very time consuming, very expensive, and quite restrictive, which is why I would suggest if anyone wants to up the game and do a literature review that is better than a literature review, they should do something called a rigorous review. And I would actually request people to Google rigorous reviews, put my name against it and see. Even in that, we registered it with the EPI reviewer, we followed the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but it allows you to be a bit more open. So rigorous reviews will allow you to incorporate things like gray literature. I mean, in Pakistan, for example, we have a lot of literature that is not necessarily published. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable, right? So for us, it would instantly get excluded from a systematic review. So what you would be then able to say is that based on these 5 or 10 studies, this is what we, and in Pakistan, if your focus is just, for example, in Pakistan, it may even be 1 or 2 studies. So my suggestion is that I think rigorous reviews are a really underused resource. And they are a very, if you are interested, I would suggest, if you're working in education, especially, to consider conducting rigorous reviews rather than systematic reviews. I mean, the systematic reviews are very powerful, but they're very powerful in health specifically, more so than in education, I feel.
So just to, contextualize this, if somebody is looking for literature to create a new, let's say, a typology of responsibility in a certain organization, do you suggest a rigorous review instead of systematic literature review, which includes the, looking at the corpus available and then drawing out different hierarchy of responsibilities in an organization? So would that, yeah.
I still think, again, Mevish, I think it depends on, so you need to first understand the question, I think, and then I think you need to see, as researchers, I think we have a rough sense of what literature exists, right? Even before we start searching, we have a rough idea of what literature exists. If you think that that literature is randomized controlled trials and experimental in nature, and I can see a few questions, what should we do in computer science? If you know that you will find literature that is conducive to a systematic review, do it. If you know already that, for example, the type of literature that you will find is not experimental in nature, is more qualitative, is more correlational and descriptive, I would steer clear of systematic reviews, because you will end up with just look at the example I shared. This was a 9-month-long exercise. We searched the globe and we ended up with 15 studies, okay, out of 4,000 hits. So that in itself, I feel, is an important thing to remember, that 15 is not a large number. And part of the reason why we couldn't do a very statistical analysis is because it was just 15 studies. So I think just be mindful of what you're trying to look at. And I would say it's the same for students of agriculture, whatever field you're working in. I think whichever field, is it agriculture, computer science, mathematics, start from the question and look at the type of studies that exist. Do some kind of basic searching before you launch yourself into a systematic review.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much for that. So based on your experience, what do you think are the most common mistakes that researchers conduct while carrying out the systematic literature review, and how can they avoid those?
Saying the same thing, but I'll say it again. I think the biggest mistake is to do a systematic review when it shouldn't be done. Because as I said, a systematic review is actually, when I did my first systematic review, I said I'll never do another one, because it was so painful getting to grips. What I've just talked about right now is just the bare bones. The detail that goes into doing systematic reviews is quite intensive. It's intensive. It's resource intensive, time intensive if you actually want to do a good quality systematic review. So I would suggest that, one of the common mistakes is to do one when you can't actually do one. So that's one of the first ones. I think the other one is at the various stages themselves. The various stages themselves, I feel, you can make errors. So, for example, not searching for the right terms, or even before that, your research question, you will be given one research question, but that research question basically needs to be thought about very carefully, broken up into sub-research questions. At the search stage I've mentioned, who is screening the studies? That's also important. So, for example, in some reviews that we've done, we have we knew that we needed qualitative researchers, and I'm not necessarily a qualitative researcher. So in the review team, you need to have someone who has the expertise to look at the qualitative research. Then you need to have expertise of just quantitative researchers if your systematic review is focused on that. So there are various aspects that need to be considered.
Thank you so much. My last question from you is that for conducting a systematic literature review, how many studies are essential? This is actually coming from your conversation about limited literature available and literature review not being valid on a certain number of research products. So what is the acceptable number of research studies that should be added to the systematic literature review for it to become valid?
So I think it's very difficult for me to answer that question because I have seen systematic reviews with only one study. But those systematic reviews were not necessary. They were published, but those systematic reviews were not necessarily used ever. They don't become useful products. They don't get cited. They don't necessarily get published in journal publications, even though they might be registered on websites and so on and so forth. So I don't think I can answer that question, but I would say that in my mind, also it depends on what you can do then. With 2 studies or 3 studies in a systematic review, what do? All you can say is that these 3 studies have found this. With 15 studies, all we could do is adopt a narrative synthesis approach. We couldn't extract the information and conduct any statistical analysis. That was a limitation. So I don't think there's a standard answer to that, and I don't want to tie myself up by saying 10 for 15, 20. I would just say that it depends also on the field. So I think if you look at systematic reviews in health literature in health fields, you'll find that they're based often on like 12, 15, 20 studies, even more. In education, it's less, far less. I don't see systematic reviews. I can see some systematic reviews coming now in education on very specific topics, and they can be based on large number of studies as well. So it depends very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Munaza. We have some more questions where I would like to encourage the participants to please refer to online resources available. Questions like how to synthesize narrative reviews and what's the difference between different types of reviews. So I think these queries can be taken to the online sources available. And with this, Munaza, any last things that you want to add and any direction you want to offer to the audience?
No, thank you so much for involving me in this. It was absolutely my pleasure. I think I will just say to everyone who is here, who's participating, if they're students, just be very careful about the use of the term systematic review. This is like something that I'm very, very, passionate about, because systematic reviews are just that. They are very specific terminologies. If you are interested in doing a review that's not systematic, it's either a literature review, it could be a rigorous review, it could just be some form of review, it could be something different. But I hope that, this has excited some of you to explore the literature and look into actually conducting a systematic review. I don't want to put anyone off. They're amazing tools. They are extremely high quality. They're called the gold standard of reviewing alongside meta-analyses. So I would urge you to really look into and explore some of these systematic reviews. And I hope, you publish them over the next few years.
Thank you so much. We will share all resources that Dr. Munaza will share with us with you all, so that you can refer to her presentation and go through these, the different tools that she has talked about. Munaza, in your session, we have a participation from 42 different countries, spanning over African region, Asia, Central Asia, and European countries. Thank you so much for this incredibly insightful session. This was really engaging and very knowledgeable. I truly enjoyed it. And Dr. Roxana also wanted me to pass on her sincere regrets for not being able to attend the session because she had a prior engagement which could not be rescheduled. But she did ask me to convey her best regards to you, and we look forward to future collaboration possibilities with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much.
Have a great day, everyone. Khuda Hafiz.